You see it first as a grainy image, a snapshot meant to be a joke but instead frozen forever in the country's memory. It's December 2006, a United Service Organizations tour in the Middle East. Al Franken, then still a comedian best known from Saturday Night Live, leans over the body of Leanne Tweeden, a radio host and model asleep in a flak vest aboard a military aircraft. His hands hover mockingly close to her chest, his face grinning toward the camera. The photo was never meant for you, but when it surfaces in 2017, the image is inescapable. Printed on news sites, aired on television, dissected in every possible angle. This is where the story begins. Not with laws, not with ethics codes, but with a photograph that becomes both evidence and symbol. For some, it's undeniable proof of misconduct. For others, it's a bad joke, aged terribly. But either way, it sparks a reckoning that stretches beyond one senator, colliding with the Eat or Me Too movement and reshaping the careers of powerful men across America. And before you drift too far into that controversy, let me welcome you gently. You're listening to 102 Hours, your late-night corner for true crime and mysteries, where the whispers of history and scandal unfold in the softest cadence. I'm here with you, guiding you through this case. No rush, no shouting, only a steady unraveling. While you listen, take a second to like and subscribe. Not as a chore, but as a way of staying close to these stories. Drop your local time and where you're tuning in from down in the comments, because it's always comforting to see this community stretch across time zones. Now, back to that photograph, the one that changed everything. The image had been taken 11 years before it went public, but its impact felt immediate, as if the shutter had just clicked. Tweeden released it alongside her personal account in November 2017, describing how Franken allegedly forced a kiss during a rehearsal skit for the troops. She explained that she felt humiliated, cornered, powerless to stop it. Her voice didn't emerge in isolation. It resonated at a moment when stories of Harvey Weinstein and other powerful men were dominating the news cycle. A cultural shift was happening, and the photograph acted like a fuse thrown onto dry tinder. The historical fact here is undeniable. Photographs have often been central in shaping political narratives. Think of the Zapruder film after Kennedy's assassination, or the haunting Vietnam War images that fueled anti-war sentiment. In Franken's case, one still image carried nearly the same weight as testimony, forcing America to confront the blurred line between humor and harm. Of course, the story gained quirky layers almost immediately. Internet sleuths debated whether Tweeden's eyes were fully closed, whether Franken's hands actually made contact, even whether the shot was staged with her prior knowledge. Some defenders pointed to other satirical performances Franken had staged in the past, suggesting he simply repeated a bad comedic instinct. Investigators still question whether this was a deliberate act of humiliation or an ill-judged attempt at humor never meant to leave the aircraft. Franken himself quickly apologized, saying he remembered the events differently, but admitted the photo was embarrassing and inappropriate. That word, inappropriate, became a flashpoint. To some, it was a minimization, a way of brushing aside what Tweeden described as a clear violation. To others, it was a man acknowledging a poor joke without admitting to criminality. In a political culture that feeds on absolutes, his careful phrasing only deepened the controversy. As the image circulated, the consequences snowballed. Late-night hosts, columnists, and even satirical cartoons replicated the photo, sometimes exaggerating Franken's grin, sometimes spotlighting Tweeden's stillness. What had been a backstage gag now played on a global stage, amplified in every imaginable medium. You watch as reputations can collapse not over years of trial, but over one still frame. That has the chilling power of visuals in the digital age. And yet, the photo alone didn't carry the whole case. It acted instead like a key that unlocked doors for other women to share their own experiences with Franken. Each account added weight, making the image less a one-off gag and more a symbol of a pattern. Still, the image remained the talisman, the artifact that headlines chose again and again. In hindsight, this photograph feels like both artifact and weapon. It is artifact in that it documents a culture of casual dismissals, the way women in male-dominated spaces were often treated as props in someone else's comedy. It is weapon in that it mobilized outrage, pushed colleagues to demand action, and gave the public a focal point for anger. You picture the senator years later, reflecting on that moment. He admits he regrets the photo, regrets the damage, regrets the way it overshadowed his legislative work. But regrets can't erase pixels. The image is immortal, carried in servers, endlessly replicated. In political history, it joins a long list of visuals that define legacies in ways speeches or bills never could. So, you begin here, with one frozen moment that turned a senator's career upside down. A pair of hands hovering, a grin stretched too wide, and a nation deciding what that meant. This is Al Franken. Power, photos, and political consequences. And that photo is your entry point. A visual accusation, a cultural symbol, and a reminder that in the age of Me Too, some images simply cannot be laughed away. You remember him first as the face of satire, not the shadow of scandal. Before Al Franken stood in the halls of the Senate, he lived on your television. A sharp-tongued performer on Saturday Night Live who turned parody into a weekly ritual. He wrote the skits that skewered presidents, lampooned celebrities, and left audiences chuckling late into Saturday nights. To many, he was the man behind the laughs, a jester exposing power through comedy. But you also sense something else. An edge, a bite to his humor that didn't fade even when the lights went off. That edge followed him into politics. The leap from comedy to Congress seems improbable, but history offers precedent. Ronald Reagan traded Hollywood scripts for the Oval Office. Sonny Bono and Jesse Ventura flipped fame into elected office. Franken joined that line in 2008 when, after a bitterly contested recount, he claimed a U.S. Senate seat from Minnesota by just 312 votes. A sliver of ballots separated him from his Republican opponent Norm Coleman. That razor-thin margin, confirmed only after months of recounts and legal wrangling, became the stuff of Minnesota political legend. You can almost hear the sighs of exhausted election workers as they tallied vote after vote. But Franken was more than a novelty candidate. He entered politics carrying years of political commentary, sharpened in books like Rush Limbaugh is a Big Fat Idiot, and Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them. He positioned himself as a watchdog against conservative spin, a media-savvy Democrat who understood both sound bites and satire. For many progressives, his election felt like a victory for wit over bluster, intellect over talking points. Historical fact. Once sworn in, Franken built a reputation as a serious legislator, surprising those who expected him to play the clown. He worked diligently on issues ranging from net neutrality to veterans affairs, amassing respect even among colleagues who had doubted his seriousness. In committee hearings, he displayed a knack for detail, grilling witnesses with precise questions that left viewers marveling at his preparation. Still, quirks from his comedic past lingered. In early photo ops, Franken often struck exaggerated poses, mugging for cameras with broad smiles, a habit that endeared him to some and unsettled others. One fringe tidbit that surfaced during the later scandal was a set of staged 2000 photos of Franken playfully groping Ariana Huffington in jest, photos she later defended as consensual parody, but which resurfaced in 2017 as awkward reminders of his comedic instincts. For critics, these images blurred the line between shtick and seriousness, humor and harassment. The transition from satirist to senator also tested Franken's own instincts. In comedy, the sharper the barb, the bigger the laugh. In politics, the sharper the barb, the riskier the fallout. Colleagues noted he could be brusque, impatient when others lacked preparation. Constituents admired his earnestness but sometimes recoiled at his occasional sarcasm. Humor that once cut through hypocrisy now risked cutting allies. Investigators still question whether Franken ever fully shed the habits of satire, or whether those instincts lingered in ways that later compounded his downfall. Was the photo with Leon Tweeden an extension of that satirical reflex, the instinct to push boundaries for a laugh? Or was it something darker, a sign that power had emboldened him to ignore boundaries altogether? For now, you see a man straddling two identities. On one hand, the senator who worked long hours, championed consumer protections, and built credibility through substance. On the other, the comedian whose entire career thrived on blurring the line between respect and ridicule. Those dual legacies collided in the public's imagination, making the 2017 revelations feel both shocking and strangely unsurprising. It's worth pausing here to note that Franken never faced criminal charges for any of the allegations. His legacy then lives in perception, not in court rulings. That makes his background as a performer all the more relevant. Perception was always his medium. He knew how to deliver a punchline, how to play to an audience. And in politics, perception can be a harsher judge than any jury. You imagine him in his Senate office, walls lined with books, photos from campaigns, and keepsakes from SNL. A man who fought his way from sketches to the Senate floor. A man who, for nearly a decade, embodied progressive energy and legislative detail. Yet also a man whose humor, the very thing that brought him fame, would eventually shadow his political fate. So, as you turn the page in this story, you carry that contradiction. Al Franken, the satirist who became a senator, and the senator who could never quite leave the satirist behind. You picture it vividly. The year is 2006. The desert air heavy with dust, the roar of military aircraft overhead. You are aboard a cargo plane heading back from a United Service Organizations tour meant to lift the spirits of U.S. troops stationed far from home. Amid the laughter and scripted comedy, something unscripted allegedly unfolds, and more than a decade later, that moment would ricochet across the nation. Leon Tweeden, a Los Angeles radio host and model, breaks her silence in November 2017. She publishes an essay with her account of that USO tour, describing how fellow performer Al Franken allegedly cornered her during rehearsal for a skit. According to her, the skit called for a kiss, but Franken insisted on practicing it privately, pushing the matter despite her discomfort. Tweeden claims he then forced a kiss on her, pressing his lips against hers, his hand holding the back of her head. She says she felt trapped, humiliated, and powerless to push him away without disrupting the morale of the trip. Her account doesn't stop there. Alongside her words, Tweeden releases the now infamous photograph. Franken smirking at the camera, his hands poised inches from her chest as she sleeps in protective gear. For her, the image crystallizes the imbalance of power and the deep discomfort she carried silently for years. For the public, the photograph is a visual shock, leaving little room for interpretation. It is this combination, a personal testimony plus undeniable imagery, that makes her story impossible to ignore. Historical fact: USO tours have long been steeped in patriotic imagery, with stars from Bob Hope to Marilyn Monroe performing for troops overseas. These tours are designed to uplift, not unsettle. That is why Tweeden-Etche's story resonated so forcefully. The setting of the alleged misconduct clashed sharply with the ideals of morale and respect that USO trips were meant to uphold. As Tweeden's account spread, quirky side details surfaced. For instance, some media outlets replayed old footage of Franken parodying politicians with exaggerated intimacy, almost as if looking for hints of a pattern in his comedy. Others combed through her career, noting her background in modeling and television, as if to measure her credibility by unrelated yardsticks. In the fevered media climate of 2017, every detail, from her wardrobe in past photo shoots to Franken's own comedic history, became part of the trial by public opinion. Investigators still question whether the kiss happened exactly as Tweeden described. Franken himself issued a statement acknowledging the photo was inappropriate, but said he remembered the rehearsal incident differently, insisting he never intended harm. Yet, the photograph gave her allegations weight beyond dispute. Even those who wanted to defend Franken found it difficult to explain away the image. Tweeden later revealed how long she carried the unease in silence. For more than 10 years, she chose not to speak out, fearing backlash, ridicule, or dismissal. The timing of her decision, in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein revelations and the Me Too wave, underscored a broader cultural shift. Women across industries were finding their voices, and her story became part of that collective reckoning. As you listen closely, you notice the emotional complexity woven into her account. Tweeden stressed that the incident made her feel violated, not in the same sense as criminal assault, but in a way that stripped away dignity and safety. The distinction mattered, because her story forced people to grapple with misconduct that lived in the gray areas. Unwanted, but difficult to prosecute, harmful yet often dismissed as just a joke. And yet, the backlash toward Tweeden was immediate. Some commentators questioned her motives, others accused her of political bias, since she worked at a conservative radio station. In the polarized atmosphere of 2017, even personal trauma was filtered through red and blue lenses. Still, her bravery in releasing the photo and describing the alleged forced kiss gave other women courage to step forward with their own stories. You reflect here on the cost of speaking up. It isn't only Franken's reputation that hangs in the balance, but Tweeden's own credibility and peace of mind. Once her story went public, she could not pull it back. Her name became linked forever with that photograph, with those allegations, with the firestorm they unleashed. This section of the saga leaves you with a question lingering in the quiet of the night. What does justice look like when no charges are filed, when no court ever weighs evidence, but when the court of public opinion renders a swift and unforgiving verdict? Tweeden's story doesn't end with a judge's gavel. It ends with a photograph, a memory, and a world finally listening. You think at first it might stay a single story. One woman, one photograph, one moment of reckoning. But in the weeks following Leanne Tweeden's revelation, more voices rise, each carrying its own weight. 7 additional women step forward, recounting experiences that echo a similar pattern. Awkward embraces, hands slipping too low during photos, or moments of discomfort in crowded events. None of these accounts suggest a violent crime, but all describe unwanted contact, the kind that leaves a lingering sting of disrespect. The names and details differ, but the tone feels familiar. A woman at the Minnesota State Fair remembers Franken placing his hand firmly on her rear as they posed for a snapshot. Another says he squeezed her waist in a way that crossed personal boundaries. A political staffer recalls an attempted kiss after a radio show appearance. Each account lands in the media like a pebble dropped in still water, ripples spreading until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Historical fact: allegations of inappropriate touching in public spaces have toppled more than one career. Consider Gary Hart, whose presidential hopes collapsed in the 1980s after reporters pursued rumors of extramarital conduct, or more recently, Anthony Weiner, undone by his own reckless photos. Franken's case differed, but the accumulation of small, unwanted acts carried the same devastating effect, eroding trust in a public figure once considered safe and serious. And then came the quirky side notes, the almost absurd details that surface whenever a public scandal snowballs. Some women said the touches occurred while Franken smiled for cameras in long photo lines, the kind of events where hands, elbows, and shoulders constantly bump. Defenders argued these could be innocent misinterpretations. Critics countered that patterns matter more than excuses. In one instance, a woman joked that she had tried to laugh it off at the time, only to realize years later that discomfort should never have been normal. Investigators still question whether these separate accounts amounted to a clear pattern of misconduct, or whether they reflected clumsy attempts at humor magnified under the Me Too spotlight. That debate, however, didn't matter much in the frenzy of late 2017. Perception carried more weight than nuance. When multiple women publicly share similar experiences, the sheer volume alone shifts the balance of credibility. Franken responded by saying he remembered many of the interactions differently, and in some cases didn't remember them at all. He insisted he never intentionally disrespected anyone, but those denials landed weakly against the force of growing testimony. Even if he meant no harm, the message from the accusers was clear. They felt diminished, objectified, or uncomfortable in his presence. For you, the listener, it paints a sobering picture. It's not just one photograph anymore. It's not just one story. It's a chorus. And in politics, as in life, a chorus of voices is harder to dismiss. Still, you can't help but notice the political climate shaping the narrative. These accounts surfaced at the height of the Knocker Me Too movement, when figures across Hollywood, media, and government were facing a reckoning. Each new allegation against Franken fed into that broader cultural wave. He was no longer just Al Franken the senator. He was Al Franken the symbol. Of power questioned, of boundaries blurred, of consequences demanded. Yet, within that symbolism, individual women risked their own reputations by coming forward. They knew their stories would be dissected, doubted, politicized. Their willingness to speak highlights both their courage and the culture of silence that had prevailed before. And so the scandal widened. What began with one photo now encompassed multiple memories. Whispered regrets turned into headlines, and a senator whose career once seemed defined by satire, suddenly defined by accusation. You lean back and take it in. The shift is irreversible. The photo was the spark, but the voices are the fire. You watch the scandal shift from whispers in the media to the marble corridors of the U.S. Capitol. When multiple women accuse a sitting senator of inappropriate conduct, the institution has no choice but to respond. In late 2017, the Senate Ethics Committee, the body charged with examining misconduct among its members, quietly opens a preliminary inquiry into Al Franken-Engha's behavior. For the first time, the scandal that began with a photo and personal accounts becomes an official matter of government record. The Ethics Committee is a curious institution. Its work happens mostly out of public view, shielded by confidentiality. You won't find live hearings or televised confrontations. You find quiet letters, staff interviews, and slow-moving procedural steps. But its existence carries weight. For a senator, the announcement alone that the committee is looking into your conduct is damaging. It suggests that colleagues question not only your judgment, but your fitness to serve. Historical fact. The Senate Ethics Committee has investigated its own members in several high-profile cases, including the Keating 5 scandal in the late 1980s, when senators were accused of improper favors for a savings and loan executive. Those investigations took years. In Franken's case, however, time wasn't on his side. Allegations stacked quickly, and the court of public opinion moved faster than any committee could. The quirky tidbit here is almost bureaucratic. The Ethics Committee hadn't handled a case quite like this in the Cert Me Too era. It was one thing to investigate financial impropriety or undisclosed gifts. It was another to parse whether awkward photos and alleged touches in crowded venues amounted to actionable misconduct. The committee faced the challenge of applying 20th century rules to a very 21st century scandal, one fueled by social media outrage. Investigators still question whether the committee ever intended to pursue a full inquiry or whether the announcement was more symbolic, a way to signal accountability while senators waited to see if Franken would step down voluntarily. By the time staff could begin gathering testimony, the political winds had already shifted. Calls for his resignation were growing louder each day. Franken himself welcomed the Ethics Committee review, saying he wanted the chance to tell his side and to confront the accusations formally. He framed it as due process, an opportunity to separate perception from fact. In one sense, that made him different from other politicians of the era who reflexively denied everything or lashed out at their accusers. Franken leaned into the language of investigation, almost daring colleagues to hold him to account. But in Washington, optics often outweigh process. While the Ethics Committee prepared to consider the case, Franken's colleagues were preparing something else entirely: a coordinated public rebuke. In that charged atmosphere, the promise of a slow, careful investigation could not compete with the demand for immediate action. And you notice the irony. Here was a senator who had spent nearly a decade proving he was serious, diligent, capable of detailed oversight. Now, in the moment he asked for oversight himself, there was no time. The scandal had momentum, and momentum rarely pauses for procedure. Still, the Ethics Committee's involvement mattered, even if fleeting. It placed the scandal within a formal framework, signaling that the Senate acknowledged misconduct allegations against one of its own as more than gossip. Yet the inquiry never reached a conclusion, cut short by Franken's resignation weeks later. What might have emerged, findings, exonerations, censures, remains an unanswered question, a shadow of due process left unfinished. For you, listening in the quiet, it's a reminder of how institutions strain under cultural change. Rules written for an earlier age can look clumsy when applied to modern scandals. And sometimes the machinery of accountability is too slow for the pace of outrage. So the Ethics Committee inquiry begins but never ends. It flickers briefly, like a candle against a storm, before being swept aside by louder voices and faster forces. You sense the shift not with a gavel, but with a chorus of voices. It is December 2017, and the calls begin trickling in. Democratic senators, once close colleagues of Al Franken, now publicly urging him to resign. The first few statements feel like tremors. Then, within hours, more than a dozen of his peers join in, and the tremors turn into a political earthquake. Suddenly, Franken isn't only battling allegations and an unfinished Ethics Committee review. He is facing abandonment from the very party that once celebrated his razor-thin Senate win as a triumph. The names are striking. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York becomes one of the earliest and most vocal, saying that enough was enough and Franken should step down. Other Democratic senators, men and women alike, quickly echo the sentiment. The reasoning was clear. If Democrats hoped to hold moral high ground during the It's Your Me Too wave, they could not afford to appear soft on misconduct in their own ranks. Franken, despite years of loyalty and legislative work, became the price of that stance. Historical fact. Party discipline in the Senate often determines political survival. Figures like Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s, once powerful, lost their grip almost overnight when colleagues turned away. For Franken, the parallel is clear. As long as Democrats stood with him, there was room for defense. Once they walked away, his position became untenable. A quirky tidbit adds irony. Some senators later admitted they regretted pushing so quickly for resignation. In later interviews, several said they wished Franken had been allowed the Ethics Committee process, that perhaps they acted too swiftly under public pressure. Yet in the heat of December 2017, hesitation was political suicide. To hesitate was to risk being painted as complicit. Investigators still question whether Democratic leaders calculated Franken's resignation as a necessary sacrifice, a way to show consistency while pressing for accountability against political opponents facing similar allegations. Critics argued the party demanded purity from its own but tolerated far worse elsewhere. Franken himself, in his farewell speech, alluded to this double standard, noting other men accused of more egregious acts were staying in office. The atmosphere on Capitol Hill grew surreal. Senators who once joked with Franken in hallways now issued carefully worded statements of disappointment. Staffers whispered about who might be next. Constituents flooded offices with phone calls, some demanding Franken's removal, others pleading for patience. In that swirl, the senator became less a man and more a symbol, proof that no one, not even a popular Democrat, was immune from the movement reshaping America. You imagine the personal sting in those days? Franken had fought tirelessly to prove he was more than a comedian, building respect among colleagues who once doubted him. Now, those same colleagues distance themselves with deliberate speed. Political friendships, forged over legislation and late-night debates, dissolved in a matter of hours. For you, the listener, it's a reminder of politics. Brutal truth: loyalty lasts only as long as it is convenient. In 2017, convenience meant showing the world that Democrats were serious about misconduct, even if it meant sacrificing one of their own. Franken's allies became his prosecutors, and their verdict was resignation. By the end of that week, the writing was on the wall. The party had made its choice, and Franken, isolated, had little choice left. You see the chamber filled with an uneasy silence. It is December 7th, 2017, when Al Franken walks onto the Senate floor to announce what many already expect: his resignation. The scene is at once formal and deeply personal. A man speaking to colleagues who have in many ways already judged him, yet also to a nation grappling with what accountability should look like. Franken's speech is measured, almost clinical at first. He acknowledges the seriousness of the allegations, yet he also maintains that some of the stories told about him are not accurate. Some memories not as clear-cut as headlines suggested. He doesn't lash out, but neither does he fully concede. Instead, he inhabits a complicated middle ground, accepting the consequences without confessing to every charge. Historical fact: resignation speeches in the Senate are rare and often remembered for their tone. Richard Nixon's farewell as president is remembered for defiance, Larry Craig's tangled announcements in 2007 for confusion. Franken's moment sits somewhere between sorrow and frustration, not explosive, but heavy with implication. He declares he will resign in the coming weeks, leaving space for the logistics to catch up with the politics. The quirky detail lies in what Franken chooses to highlight. He reminds his colleagues of his work on issues like net neutrality, healthcare, and consumer protection. It's as if he wants the record to reflect more than scandal, a catalog of contributions alongside the accusations. He also makes a pointed remark that he is leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office. Without naming Donald Trump, the reference is unmistakable. For investigators of political culture, this line captures the paradox of the moment. Franken steps down not because the ethics committee concludes its work, not because a court finds guilt, but because the political winds demand it. Meanwhile, others accused of equal or worse remain untouched. That contradiction fuels debates still ongoing years later. Was this accountability or expediency? Justice or sacrifice? The chamber itself bears witness with a kind of solemn choreography. Colleagues sit stiffly, some avoiding his gaze, others nodding slightly in acknowledgement. For staffers in the gallery, it is a rare spectacle: the dismantling of a Senate career in real time. Reporters scribble furiously, capturing phrases that will be replayed on news loops within minutes. And you, imagining yourself in that gallery, feel the dual weight of the words. On one hand, a senator accepts that his career is over. On the other, he leaves unresolved questions hanging in the air about fairness, due process, and the fickle nature of political loyalty. Franken's resignation speech is not remembered for fireworks, but for its haunting restraint. He does not storm out, he does not beg forgiveness. He simply marks the end of one chapter, leaving the nation to argue about what it all meant. In that moment, the Me Too era claims its first major political figure on Capitol Hill. The Senate absorbs the loss, the public debates the fairness, and Franken himself steps into an uncertain future. You feel the temperature of the country shift almost immediately after Al Franken's resignation speech. The words are still echoing in the chamber when the responses begin to pour in. From cable news panels, from local newspapers, from advocacy groups, from late-night comedians, and from ordinary voters who never imagined they'd be debating whether a senator should step down over a photograph and a handful of uncomfortable encounters. In those first hours, the national mood divides into two sharply contrasting portraits. On one side are survivors of harassment and assault who see the resignation as overdue vindication. For them, Franken's departure is symbolic proof that the Yaghurt Me Too movement can reach even the insulated marble halls of the Senate. On the other side are longtime supporters, some deeply progressive, who argue that the process feels too rushed, that allegations were too varied to all be weighed equally, and that due process had been sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. Historical fact. Major newspapers reflect this split almost instantly. The Washington Post publishes editorials praising Democrats for holding one of their own accountable, arguing that such action strengthens the party's moral authority. Yet, in the same pages, you find columns warning that Franken's case differs from others. No lengthy pattern of abuse, no criminal charges, and that equating him with more severe offenders could undermine the movement's credibility. The New York Times runs both celebratory and cautious commentaries, capturing the confusion of a nation that wants to believe women, but also wants fairness. The quirky tidbit tucked into this storm comes from Minnesota, Franken's home state. Local radio hosts organize a tongue-in-cheek contest asking listeners to design holiday cards for Al. Some draw Franken as a sad elf banished from Santa's workshop. Others picture him as a snowman melting under the glare of television spotlights. These jokes carry both satire and sorrow, expressing the odd blend of Midwestern humor and regret that many Minnesotans feel about losing a senator who, scandal aside, had delivered for their state. Among Democrats, the polarization becomes especially sharp. Younger activists insist that the party must stand firmly with survivors, that zero tolerance is the only position compatible with progress. Older liberal voters, however, voice their doubts. They remember Franken as a tireless advocate for net neutrality, rural broadband, and consumer protections. They worry that by forcing him out quickly, their party has thrown away a powerful voice in the Senate without even allowing the Ethics Committee to finish its review. Investigators still question whether this generational divide revealed a deeper tension inside the party, between a demand for absolute standards and a pragmatic instinct to fight strategically in Washington. Republicans, meanwhile, seize the opportunity. Some crow that Democrats only pushed Franken out to score political points, attempting to claim the moral high ground while ignoring accusations closer to their own ranks. Others openly mock the contradictions of Franken's exit. He insists that some accusations are exaggerated or false, yet he still resigns. Conservative talk radio fills with riffs about hypocrisy, while right-leaning columnists gleefully note that the Democrats' sacrificial lamb had been one of their more effective senators. Social media amplifies the split in dizzying ways. Hashtags like Jujuj Believe Women and Ishichu Accountability trend for days, each tweet a reminder of the collective demand for change. At the same time, Ididawa Stand With All spreads among progressives who argue that the punishment does not fit the alleged misconduct. The infamous USO tour photograph reappears endlessly, for some undeniable evidence of a man behaving inappropriately. For others, a poorly timed comedy gag misinterpreted years later. Each repost is less about the image itself and more about what the viewer believes it represents. You can almost feel the fatigue in people's voices. Friends argue over dinner tables, colleagues debate in office break rooms, strangers exchange long threads online. The case stops being about Franken as a single individual and becomes a referendum on the Me Too movement itself. Should accountability be swift and uncompromising, even at the cost of nuance? Or should every allegation be weighed carefully, with patience for due process, even if that means survivors feel unheard or delayed? The tension extends into feminist circles, where unity is usually assumed. Some leaders hail Franken's resignation as a clean break with old habits of excusing powerful men. Others worry that collapsing all behaviors into the same category, from a forced kiss to serial predation, dilutes the moral clarity of the movement. Behind closed doors, some activists debate strategy. Was this victory too quick, too symbolic, and potentially alienating to allies who might otherwise support systemic reforms? Ordinary Minnesotans, when interviewed, reveal equally complex emotions. A retired teacher says she believes the women, but still thinks her senator deserved a full investigation. A young college student says she feels proud that her state produced the first major political resignation of Me Too. A small business owner jokes that we lost our senator to a bad photo op, but then turned serious, admitting that the allegations made him reconsider what women quietly endure. Television late-night hosts, many of whom knew Franken from his comedy days, struggle with tone. Some opt for direct satire, cracking jokes about the irony of a comedian undone by an unfunny moment. Others adopt somber reflections, noting that a man they admired must still be held accountable. The duality mirrors the public mood. Laughter and loss, anger and ambiguity, all tangled together. As weeks pass, the arguments don't fade. They deepen. Polls show Democrats split almost evenly. Some convinced their party did the right thing, others convinced it acted rashly. Independents watch with curiosity, noting the contrast between Franken's exit and the survival of other political figures accused of worse. Conservative outlets continue to exploit the story as proof of Democratic weakness. Liberal outlets wrestle with the complexity, sometimes defending the decision, sometimes regretting it. From a distance, the whole affair looks like a cultural mirror held up to America. One side sees justice, the other sees injustice. One side sees progress, the other sees overcorrection. And the gap between those perspectives doesn't close. It widens. Years later, when journalists look back, they note that December 2017 marked not just a turning point for Franken, but a turning point for the way America argued about accountability. For you, as you listen now, it becomes clear the resignation was not the end of the story. It was the start of a national conversation that still hasn't settled. Whether in editorials, in coffee shops, or across endless threads of social media, the question remains unresolved. Was this accountability at its best? Or was it a moment when politics demanded sacrifice before justice had its chance to speak? You find yourself fast-forwarding nearly 2 years after Franken's resignation, when an article in The New Yorker lands like a pebble thrown into an already turbulent pond. It's July 2019, and journalist Jane Mayer publishes a long investigative piece revisiting the allegations against Al Franken, stirring debates that many thought had cooled. Suddenly, voices are raised again, this time not about whether Franken should resign, but whether the process that forced him out had been flawed from the very beginning. The piece doesn't erase what happened in 2017, but it reframes it. Mayer focuses heavily on Leanne Tweeden's account, noting contradictions between her initial statements and later clarifications. She points to the infamous USO tour photograph, emphasizing that others present recalled it as a staged joke that never involved actual physical contact. She highlights that some of Franken's other accusers were describing awkward hugs during photo lines, gestures Franken said were misinterpreted rather than malicious. To Mayer, these details suggest that Franken may have been pushed out before he had the chance to properly defend himself. Historical fact: Mayer's article sparks an immediate wave of op-eds and television segments. Some hail it as overdue re-examination. Others accuse Mayer of undermining the credibility of survivors by nitpicking. The conversation is eerily familiar, echoing the polarized days of 2017. But now, the question isn't only about Franken's conduct, it's about whether the Hishu's Me Too movement, in its early and urgent momentum, acted too quickly in his case. The quirky tidbit here lies in Franken's own reaction to the article. Around that time, he begins to appear in public again, cautiously testing the waters with small comedy performances and his own podcast. In interviews, he expresses gratitude to Mayer for taking the time to get the facts straight, He even jokes that he's spent more time learning about podcast microphones than legislation lately, a rueful acknowledgement of how his career trajectory had been redirected. What makes Mayor S' piece unique is its focus not just on Franken, but on the machinery of political scandal. She writes about how Senate Democrats felt blindsided by the speed of the controversy and pressured by the rising tide of the Me Too movement. She emphasizes how some of Franken's colleagues now privately regret calling for his resignation without waiting for the ethics committee. This theme of regret, whispered in corridors and hinted at in private interviews, becomes a haunting echo throughout her article. For investigators of political culture, this is where the case takes on a second life. It is not just about one man and one photograph anymore. It is about due process, political calculation, and the uneasy balance between listening to women and ensuring fairness. Investigators still question whether Franken's downfall was an inevitable casualty of the movement's momentum, or miscalculation amplified by the media cycle. The backlash to Mayer is fierce. Feminist activists accuse her of undermining a broader fight for justice. Conservative commentators claim her article proves what they had argued all along, that Democrats acted out of political optics rather than moral consistency. Some Democrats defend Mayer, saying she had a right to question the process. Others say revisiting the story risks weakening the credibility of the entire Me Too cause. You picture yourself in the swirl of these voices, scrolling through headlines in the summer heat of 2019, each article pulling you in opposite directions. Some argue that Franken deserves a second chance. Others insist that reopening the case dishonors the women who came forward. The polarization, far from dissipating, flares anew. Mayer's investigation doesn't restore Franken to the Senate. It doesn't erase the resignation or the pain caused by the allegations, but it ensures that the conversation will not be remembered as simple or settled. Instead, it becomes part of a larger cultural reckoning. How do we balance the urgent need to hear survivors with the equally urgent need to allow for fair judgment? And so the story of Al Franken, already layered with comedy politics and scandal, gains yet another chapter. One where memory itself becomes contested territory, where truth is sifted and resifted, and where history refuses to stay in neat categories of guilt or innocence. You see the aftershocks ripple outward from Franken's resignation, spreading far beyond one senator's career. December 2017 is not just about Minnesota losing its senior Democrat. It becomes a watershed moment for how Congress and the nation confronts allegations of misconduct. The Senate has always been a body that guards its traditions, but suddenly those traditions collide head-on with the energy of the Me Too movement. The immediate consequence is symbolic. Franken's resignation is brandished as proof that Democrats are willing to police their own ranks. For a brief time, the party enjoys praise for holding a powerful figure accountable. But symbolism cuts both ways. Republicans point to the move as evidence of Democrats sacrificing one of their sharpest lawmakers in a moment of moral theater. They ask, sometimes mockingly, sometimes sincerely, whether Democrats had set a precedent they could not always uphold. Historical fact: within months of Franken's departure, multiple members of Congress across party lines either resign or announce retirements amid allegations. Representatives like Blake Farenthold, R. Texas, and John Conyers Jr., D. Michigan, step aside under pressure. The House and Senate scramble to strengthen harassment training, update reporting systems, and eliminate taxpayer-funded settlements that had quietly protected lawmakers for decades. Franken's fall becomes part of a wave that exposes how fragile and outdated those systems really were. The quirky detail here lies in how some senators adjust their daily habits. A handful of male lawmakers begin making a point of keeping their office doors open when meeting with female staffers. Some avoid hugs entirely, replacing them with stiff handshakes or awkward waves. Capitol Hill gossip dubs this the Mike Pence effect, a tongue-in-cheek nod to rules about avoiding situations that might be misinterpreted. For staffers, it creates both relief and frustration. Relief at being taken seriously. Frustration at being treated like potential liabilities rather than trusted colleagues. In the broader landscape, the Franken case shifts the calculus of political campaigns. Candidates now face heightened scrutiny over their pasts. Old photos, college skits, or comedy routines are combed through with new seriousness. Campaign strategists advise clients to brace for opposition research not just on policy, but on personal conduct. Investigators still question whether this culture of heightened vigilance is progress toward accountability or a chilling effect that discourages authenticity in public life. For progressive Democrats, Franken's exit also sharpens awareness of double standards. The man in the Oval Office at the time, Donald Trump, had faced multiple accusations of misconduct and the infamous Access Hollywood tape, yet remained in power. The contrast between Trump's survival and Franken's resignation becomes a recurring talking point. Activists argue that Democrats must demand integrity even when politically costly. Skeptics counter that this creates asymmetry. One party sacrifices its own while the other doubles down. Outside of Washington, the case fuels conversations in workplaces across America. Corporations institute new HR policies, nonprofits revise codes of conduct, and universities revisit their procedures for reporting harassment. Franken's name is invoked not as an isolated scandal, but as part of a larger reckoning. If it can happen to a senator, it can happen anywhere. Yet there is another layer: the question of forgiveness. Some voters, especially in Minnesota, openly discuss whether resignation should mean permanent exile. Is there room for redemption in politics, or does one misstep, however serious, mark the end forever? Late-night hosts, columnists, and even church sermons toy with this question. Franken's case makes it unavoidable. The consequence, then, is not only about who holds office, it's about the standards Americans set for those who seek power, and whether those standards are applied consistently. For every person who sees progress, another sees overreach. For every headline about accountability, another headline about double standards. Looking back, you realize Franken's departure becomes less about him and more about the structures surrounding him. The Senate adapts, campaigns adjust, voters recalibrate, and the debate over fairness, accountability, and forgiveness refuses to resolve neatly. It lingers, shaping every new scandal that comes after. You step into the quieter years after the storm, where Al Franken exists less as a daily headline and more as a contested symbol. His story doesn't end with his resignation. Instead, it evolves into a complex question of whether a fallen public figure can ever reclaim a voice. After 2017, Franken retreats from Washington life, but not from public life altogether. In 2019, he cautiously reemerges through interviews and a podcast. The Al Franken Podcast, where he speaks with authors, activists, and policy experts. You hear the familiar cadence of his wit, tempered now by the weight of what he lost. For supporters, it is a welcome return, proof that the sharp mind behind Senate hearings on healthcare and net neutrality still exists. For critics, it is too soon, a reminder that wounds have not fully healed. The quirky detail here is that Franken often records episodes in his modest Minnesota home, surrounded by shelves of political books and comedy memorabilia. His guests range from progressive lawmakers to scientists explaining climate change. Listeners describe the show as part wonky seminar, part therapy session. In a strange way, the podcast mirrors his career, straddling the line between entertainer and legislator, humor and gravitas. Historical fact. In 2019, The New Yorker publishes a long retrospective piece questioning whether Franken had been forced out too quickly. Several senators who had once demanded his resignation admit to having second thoughts. Senator Patrick Leahy even confesses that urging Franken to resign was one of the biggest regrets of his career. This reopening of the debate suggests that time complicates judgment. What felt urgent in the heat of Me Too later feels, to some, hasty. But redemption is not linear. Franken flirts with the idea of returning to elected politics, a Senate run, perhaps even the governorship. Yet each trial balloon deflates quickly. Party leaders, wary of reopening old wounds, remain cool. Voters are divided. Some see a man punished out of proportion to his alleged actions. Others insist the standard of accountability must hold, no matter how talented or useful the politician might be. Investigators still question whether the idea of political redemption in the Me Too era is possible at all. Does the public ever forgive, or does the stain remain permanent? Scholars of political culture note how American history offers mixed examples. Figures like Bill Clinton, who weathered scandal and remained influential, or Anthony Weiner, who never recovered. Franken occupies a gray middle ground, neither fully exiled nor fully restored. In Minnesota, his legacy is especially complicated. Many constituents remember his Senate work fondly. His grilling of tech executives, his advocacy for veterans, his push for women's healthcare access. They speak of a pragmatic progressive who actually read the briefing binders and asked precise questions. But his resignation overshadows that record, leaving younger voters with only the image of a disgraced lawmaker. The broader legacy is even more paradoxical. On one hand, Franken becomes an emblem of accountability, proof that no one is too famous or powerful to face consequences. On the other, he becomes a cautionary tale about due process, about how quickly careers can be extinguished without formal hearings or investigation. Activists on both sides of the debate cite his case as evidence, either of progress or of excess. The quirky, almost tragic irony. Franken himself once wrote a comedy sketch about a senator caught in a scandal, forced to resign in humiliation. What was a satire in the 1990s became prophecy by 2017. In interviews, he sometimes acknowledges this with a rueful laugh, the kind of gallows humor only a comedian could muster. In the end, you are left with a legacy unresolved. Al Franken remains both the senator who fought fiercely on policy and the man who resigned under a cloud. He is both a victim of political expedience and a participant in a culture finally confronting misconduct. His name sparks debate not because his story is simple, but because it is tangled, a reminder that the lines between accountability, forgiveness, and justice are never as clear as we wish. And so his legacy lingers, suspended between cautionary tale and lost potential, a story America still hasn't finished telling. You take a step back now, widening the lens, and see that the Al Franken case was never just about one man or even one Senate seat. It was, and still is, about a country grappling with how to balance accountability, fairness, and forgiveness in an era when private behavior collides with public trust. Franken's rise and fall map neatly onto the arc of a broader cultural reckoning. A beloved comedian becomes a serious senator, a lawmaker with a reputation for intellect and progressive fight. Then, in the charged atmosphere of Me Too, he is suddenly transformed into a symbol of misconduct. His resignation is both swift and messy. Swift in that it comes before any formal hearing, messy in that it leaves a trail of questions about due process, partisanship, and proportionality. The quirky detail here is that in the weeks after his departure, bookstores in Washington reported a spike in sales of Franken's old comedy memoirs. Rush Limbaugh is a big fat idiot, and lies and the lying liars who tell them. As if readers were looking for clues in his earlier words, hoping to reconcile the satirist with the disgraced senator. That curiosity reflects how Americans often search for coherence in scandal, to explain, to contextualize, to reframe. Historical fact: Franken's resignation speech, delivered on the Senate floor in December 2017, remains one of the rare times a sitting senator has voluntarily stepped down amid allegations of sexual misconduct without a formal ethics trial. In that moment, he invoked his own sense of public duty, saying he could not both serve Minnesotans and fight an investigation. But he also notably said some of the allegations were not accurate, leaving his exit tinged with ambiguity. That ambiguity is what keeps the debate alive. For investigators, activists, and voters alike, the lingering question is this: did the country gain more than it lost? Investigators still question whether the decision to demand Franken's resignation strengthened democratic accountability, or whether it created a dangerous precedent where political survival depends less on evidence and more on optics. Was justice served, or was haste the victor? The Franken case mirrors America's ongoing struggle with scandal itself. In a nation that prides itself on second chances, it reveals how conditional redemption really is. In a democracy that demands accountability, it shows how unevenly accountability is applied. And in a media environment fueled by outrage, it highlights how speed often trumps nuance. For the victims of harassment everywhere, Franken's story is a reminder of how powerful the movement for change became in 2017. That silence could be broken, that careers could end, that institutions could not look away. For Franken supporters, it is a reminder of fragility, that even a progressive champion could be undone in days before a single hearing, before a single vote of censure. And for you, the listener, the story leaves a question hanging in the quiet. How do you want accountability to look in your society? Is it swift and uncompromising, or careful and deliberate? Should the weight of accusation be enough, or must it always be paired with investigation? In the soft, reflective tone of this narrative, you realize there is no neat conclusion. Al Franken's case is not simply a fall from grace, but a mirror that reflects a nation in conflict with itself, torn between the urgency of justice and the patience of fairness, between the permanence of shame and the possibility of redemption. And maybe, just maybe, that mirror will continue to shape how the next scandal is seen, judged, and remembered. You let the sound soften now, like the dimming of a lamp at the end of a long night. After 12 sections of detail, debate, and reflection, you drift back into stillness. The story of Al Franken, power, photos, and political consequences, lingers not as a sharp headline but as a muted echo, like footsteps fading in a marble hallway. You followed the rise of a comedian who became a senator, the shock of allegations, the swift fall, and the unresolved questions about justice, fairness, and accountability. You've seen how the scandal spilled beyond one office in Minnesota, shaping conversations in Washington, workplaces, and even living rooms across America. And you've watched how the reckoning of 2017 still shadows the present. A reminder that scandal is never just about the person at the center, but about the values of the society that responds. The quirky thing about endings like this is that they never really end. The questions hang in the air, unanswered, waiting for the next case, the next reckoning, the next headline. Investigators still question whether the Franken moment was a turning point or just another chapter in America's long, unfinished argument about power and consequence. For now, though, you don't need to solve it. You only need to exhale. Let the story rest, and let yourself rest too. You've made it through every turn, every quiet irony, every unresolved thread. And here, in the hush after the telling, you realize that sometimes the value is not in the answers, but in the act of slowing down to ask the questions. So, wherever you are, whatever the hour on your clock, allow your shoulders to relax. Let the words dissolve into background hum. The scandal, the Senate, the storm, they can all wait until tomorrow. Tonight, you've heard enough.